am part of the solution. I am part of the solution.
To be here, we commend the African Union, the Kenyan government and President Ruto for convening this African Climate Summit and to really put Africa on the forefront of the solutions to climate change. I would like to pick up from the Colombian minister when you said we face a climate emergency. That is absolutely true. We are in a critical decade where we need to reduce emissions by 43% globally if we want to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is sticking to 1.5 degree maximum warming. It's also a critical decade for the development and the fight against poverty in Africa. And the two very much go together. And what my proposition here today is that actually the global climate agenda is an agenda, a strategy for growth, for innovation, for investment. That's what we are doing in the European Union with the European Green Deal, which we are developing and implementing as a growth and investment strategy, because we know that a growth model based on fossil fuels, based on wasted of resources, based on environmental degradation has no future. We need a new form of growth. We have agreed with 27 countries democratically that we will reduce our carbon emissions, or greenhouse gas emissions actually, by at least 55% by 2030. And that requires massive investment in Europe. We estimate that we will need to get there, mobilize at least 700 billion euros additional investment per year up to 2030 to achieve this, because we are so locked in a fossil fuel-based system. So we need to mobilize and steer and direct investment, both public and private investment. And that is what we're trying to do through the sustainable finance strategy. Now, this needs to happen at global level. We really need a reform of the global financial system or architecture. And that's actually very much spelled out in the Paris Agreement, which says that we should align all financial flows in accordance with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I really would like to commend Barbados for the Bridgetown agenda, which really has kicked that agenda very high on the attention of our political leaders. We need to work on this at all levels: national, regional, and global. Now, we from Europe would like to welcome the growing interest that we see in carbon pricing globally. In Europe, we are realizing our reduction of emissions in great part thanks to the emission trading system. It is what I would call the workhorse of our climate agenda in Europe. We have achieved in the sectors that are subject to ETS emission reductions of 37% since 2005. And in the last 10 years only, the ETS system has generated 152 billion euros of revenues, which we reinvest in industrial innovation, in social policies, and indeed in climate finance to help the rest of the world, especially the least developed countries. We are ready to share that experience, both in how you can use it to reduce emissions and generate revenues to reinvest in your clean energy system, in your green industrialization agenda. And that's why President von der Leyen, who will be talking to this in the plenary session tomorrow morning, has launched at the Paris Summit on the global financial architecture, a call to action for Paris-aligned carbon markets, with the idea of promoting the expansion and deepening of domestic carbon markets, which also Kenya is now doing and others in Africa, to support the full implementation of the agreed Article 6 rulebook for international compliance markets, and indeed to ensure high integrity in voluntary carbon markets. We would love to see African countries join this call for action, because Africa can be a big and very convincing advocate towards the major emitters in the world to adopt this carbon pricing, but it will also send a signal, a very important signal to the market that policy frameworks will be based on the right conditions for integrity in carbon markets, and so that there is sharing of benefits with the local communities. That is very important as a condition for carbon markets. Now, all this goes hand in hand with the development of sustainable finance tools and frameworks, such as green taxonomy, disclosure rules for the financial sector, for the corporate sector, but also green bonds, green standards, labels, and many other of these tools, which we in the EU have developed. We continue to develop them, and we find it very encouraging to see that more and more countries in the north and in the south are putting in place such tools. South Africa, for example, has introduced a green finance taxonomy last year, not exactly the same like the European one, but that's fine because every situation is different. Kenya, already in 2019, was the first African nation to issue green bonds, which we welcome a lot, and we have other of these examples in Africa. So the EU and Africa have different starting points, but we have the common imperative of unleashing sustainable finance, as I said, both private and public as well. So you asked us what the EU will do. Well, the EU, the European Union, will continue to support governments and businesses in this direction and in this endeavor. We have the Global Gateway from now until 2027, which will mobilize investment of 300 billion euros, 150 of which will go to Africa. That includes the European Sustainable Development Fund, which will provide guarantees to de-risk and leverage private investment, which we really see as a big opportunity and need in Africa as well. We have launched the Team Europe Commission with member states, the Team Europe Global Green Bond Initiative, to facilitate the flow of private capital into climate and environmental projects in partner countries, notably in Africa, and with the European Investment Bank, which is very present also during this conference, we have now committed 1 billion euros, which will mobilize, we estimate, 15 to 20 billion euros of investments in green bonds in partner countries. We have also set up an international platform on sustainable finance, to which we would invite all countries, including in Africa, to join, so that we have a common direction for this work. And indeed, as you said, Fanny, we have set up a high-level expert group on scaling up sustainable finance in low and middle-income countries, with exactly the ambition of finding what are the right tools, the right financial instruments, the right policy conditions and frameworks that we need in low and middle income countries to make sure that this investment happens, very much in line with what we hear from Barbados indeed. A last point, if I may, all this must go together with domestic public revenue mobilization. You were absolutely right, but also with conducive, consistent, green fiscal and budgetary policies, so that there is consistency in the signals we are sending as governments especially. That can include carbon taxes, as I mentioned, but also the phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies. And I would like to say that I strongly agree with the minister from Colombia that we not only have to rely on the private sector. The private sector is key. This agenda will not happen without a private sector massive involvement. But we also need to strengthen the public sector. The public sector must have the capacity to direct all these flows and to make sure that there is a revenue for the private sector, but also for society. Where there is potential return on investment, the private sector has to come in, and we have to make sure it does deliver a return on investment. But the climate agenda indeed also has areas for investment like adaptation where the return on investment is not that clear, and there public support will indeed remain very important. Thank you very much for having me.
All right, thank you very much. Let's give Kurt a round of applause.
We are part of the solution. I am part of the solution.